29-year-old hairdresser brutally stabbed to death on her doorstep in a quiet suburban street.
Nisha had just her night clothes on and no footwear, so we had bare footprints in blood walking up the pavement.
The victim's husband had been receiving menacing phone calls.
And clearly it was a threat that had to be taken seriously. We've got a dead person and we've got someone making direct threats against that family.
But what can police do when there's no critical evidence linking the killer with the murder?
There's no fingerprints, there's no DNA. The evidence is circumstance.
When there's a murder with no suspect, no leads, perhaps not even a body, that's when investigators face their toughest test. The evidence must be gathered. The evidence must be analysed. But the evidence is worthless if you can't pin it to a suspect. The only way to crack the hardest cases of all, the only way to prove what happened, the difference between success and failure, critical evidence. Close to midnight on the 11th of May 2006, police received a desperate 999 call. A young woman had been viciously stabbed on the doorstep of her house in Wembley, North London. Neighbours living opposite in the quiet suburban street heard her screams and rushed to help. This is a recording of the 999 call made by a neighbour who went to Nisha's aid.
My neighbour next door to me has been stabbed and there is blood everywhere. We think it's somebody in the street. He was outside her house.
The victim of this horrific attack was 29-year-old Fadi Nasri. She was a hairdresser. Her husband, Fadi Nasri, was out playing snooker. Another neighbour called him. He rushed home, but Nisha was losing a lot of blood.
Yeah, look, there's blood all over.
Right, madam, calm down and bear with me.
There's a lot of blood.
Okay, right, bear with me, I'll get the police down from the way. Don't mind me.
Please, as soon as she's unconscious.
Paramedics reached the scene and Fadi arrived just as they took his wife to hospital. He followed the ambulance. The deep knife wound inflicted in Nisha's groin had severed an artery. She was dead within an hour of being attacked. The police were now dealing with a homicide. Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola headed for the crime scene shortly after Nisha's death.
When you first arrive at a scene like that, you're looking for evidential opportunities. Obviously you want to know what happened, but also need to find out how it happened. So as you're approaching, you're scanning for CCTV cameras, and you're thinking witness opportunities as well, as you're looking around, seeing how is the scene overlooked, who might have been there.
But the crime scene was a dimly lit, quiet suburban street. What CCTV cameras there were revealed nothing useful, and shocked neighbours could tell police little more than how they found Nisha screaming and bleeding in the street. The killer, having inflicted a single deadly stab wound, seemed to have vanished.
When I first recall the scene of the attack on Nisha, what immediately springs to mind was the amount of blood outside her house, and the trail, you could see how it went up the road and then back down the road to where she eventually collapsed, and the quantity of blood was quite astonishing.
At first light, officers recorded video evidence footage of the crime scene. A blood trail led from Nisha's front door down the street. The pattern might tell the police something about the attack. It was critical evidence. A specialist was called in to analyze the pattern of blood. Forensics expert Dr. Jennifer Guest.
Basically what that involves is trying to look at the shape and the distribution of the bloodstains to try and work out what's happened during a bloodletting event. So we can try and say where somebody's been, what sequence things occurred in, and we can try and identify bloodstains which are unusual, which are separate from the others, which don't fit with the pattern, and they could maybe be used to try and identify a suspect, say, or another person who's been involved. We knew that she'd had a heavily bleeding injury, and we knew from some neighbours' accounts where she'd been, and so it was just a matter of looking at the bloodstain patterns and seeing if it fitted with what we thought had happened, and to see if there was something else, something additional, something unusual which didn't fit. I did have a look inside the house to have a look and see if anything had happened in the house, whether the killer had got in and the fight had started in there or the injury had started inside, but there was no sign of any bloodstaining really inside. It all seemed to be outside. So to me, it looked like she'd opened the door and been stabbed almost straight away. And then she'd come out immediately and started looking for help.
There was no trace of the killer from the blood spatter evidence, but forensic analysis revealed Nisha's final tragic moments.
Whatever had happened fairly quickly, and the killer had left almost straight away. They hadn't hung around, there hadn't been a big struggle. There was no sign of that. Just looked to me like Nisha walking up, looking for help, staying in one place for a period of time and bleeding, and then walking back.
But this picture of Nisha's movements provoked more questions than answers. How did she come to be out in the street in her night clothes? Also assigned to the case was Detective Sergeant Adam Manley.
Why did she run down the road? Why was the door open? Was she chasing someone? Was she running away from someone? Those are the immediate questions I had. The fact that the door was open made you suspicious of someone going into the address, but we weren't certain at that point. It could have happened outside or it could have happened inside the house.
Evidence inside the house raised even more questions. In the living room, Nisha's phone, £380 in cash from her day's hairdressing takings, and her purse, full of credit cards, all lay untouched.
It wasn't obvious why it happened. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Nisha had no obvious enemies. It remained a mystery to exactly why she was stabbed.
So, why had Nisha Patel Nasri been killed? Had she disturbed a burglar who then fled the scene without grabbing the cash? Possibly, but the evidence suggested that Nisha had been stabbed on her own doorstep, suddenly and deliberately. Had she confronted someone in the driveway? Was this attack something more than a burglary gone wrong? Within hours of Nisha's death, detectives questioned her husband, Fadi.
Because in most homicides, the victim knows their killer, we clearly eliminate the close family as early as we can in the investigation. In this particular investigation, Fadi Nasri was playing snooker with a close friend, so he had a good alibi.
The bereaved husband wasn't a suspect. But when detective asked him if he could think of anyone who might want to harm Nisha, he told them that someone had threatened both him and his wife. He played detectives a recording of a telephone call.
Get your away out of your house now, and I'm not joking in that. You have with the wrong person here, pal. You are so dead.
In May 2006, 29-year-old hairdresser Nisha Patel Nasri was brutally stabbed on her doorstep in North London. The senior investigating officer in charge was Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola, and he felt an added pressure to get a result. Nisha had served as a special constable, a volunteer police officer.
The fact Nisha was a special constable definitely places you under more pressure when you start the investigation. Obviously, you want to solve every murder you deal with, or every investigation you deal with. So it's not so much the wanting to solve it pressure, it's the fear of failure pressure. You don't want to be the senior investigating officer that doesn't solve a murder of one of our own.
But the motive for Nisha's murder was a mystery. It didn't appear to be linked to her police work. and it had been established that Nisha's husband, Fadi Nasri, wasn't a suspect in his wife's murder. Detective Sergeant Adam Manley had questioned the couple's friends and family about their relationship.
The early picture we had is of a loving couple, happily married. They bought themselves a nice house in the Subby Road. They had access to money. They had a business that was clearly doing well. The indications were they had a rock-solid marriage and everything was fine between them.
The couple's success was on display outside their home. Fadi ran a stretch limo hire company. But recently, he'd had a problem.
Very soon after the murder, within a couple of hours, I had a conversation with Fadi Nasri outside his home address about who he suspected may have murdered his wife.
Fadi did indeed suspect someone, and it seemed with good reason. He'd sold a vehicle to a firm in Glasgow. The buyers had been unhappy with it, and Fadi had taken it back without their knowledge. Furious, the Glaswegians were making threats. Fadi played detectives a recording of a phone call he'd received.
And you're going to be one sorry man. You're with the wrong person this time, pal.
He gave me the phone and played the conversation he'd had with a woman in Scotland. Clearly, that's evidentially very important.
But you might be clever and you've got away with it, but rest assured, your legs are going to be snapped in two. Get away out your house now. And I'm not joking in that. You have with the wrong person here, pal. You are so dead.
So that was of obviously clear and important relevance to us. So we immediately started making inquiries in Scotland. That was a very, very important first part of our investigation, to get up to Scotland, to interview her and to see what she had to say about Fadi Nasri and about the reasons why she'd threatened him.
Within a couple of hours of Nisha's death, the police had gathered a piece of critical evidence that gave them a solid lead. A team of officers from the Met headed north to trace the Glaswegian woman who had threatened Fadi and Nisha. But senior investigating officer DCI Nick Scola knew they were a long way from cracking the case. They needed proof that the woman was connected to Nisha's murder.
It involved detectives going to Scotland, interviewing her, interviewing those who worked for her, checking phone records, automatic number plate registration readouts to see if any cars associated with her might be making the journey to London.
We needed to see what contacts she may have had with people in London, whether people from London were travelling back up to Glasgow to see her.
Whoever killed Nisha hadn't done it from the end of a phone 500 miles away in Glasgow. They'd come face to face with their victim. The police knew that whatever had happened, it had happened quickly. Nisha had died from one fatal knife wound from a blade big enough to sever an artery. While they waited for the results from Glasgow, the police returned to the crime scene. Was there more evidence to be gathered? When detectives examined the inside of Nisha's house, they noticed something out of place.
There was a knife missing from a knife block inside the kitchen. It was the largest knife from the block.
It was the sort of house that was ordered, clean, and you got the feeling about Nisha that she was an ordered person. If that knife was going to be anywhere, it would have been in that house.
But Nisha's husband had been spoken to and he said the knife had been there earlier. So I knew someone had taken it.
Was the missing knife the murder weapon? The police knew from blood spatter analysis that Nisha had been stabbed outside her front door.
Nisha and her husband ran a limousine business, and one of the limousines was parked outside the address. So quite early, the hypothesis formed that she became aware of someone interfering and perhaps trying to steal that car, had self-armed with a knife from the kitchen and gone outside to challenge them. And whatever followed, she had been disarmed and stabbed with her own knife. The knife's no longer at the scene, which meant the assailant took the knife away with him. As the assailant hadn't arrived with the knife, I thought, well, he's got no plan to dispose of it. It's spontaneous to him. So he suddenly found himself with a very large knife in his hand, running away from a dead body. So I suspect he would have to get rid of it somewhere, so it's just a matter of where.
Of all the evidence that police can gather in a homicide inquiry, the murder weapon can sometimes prove to be the most critical. If they could find the missing knife, they might get a trace of the killer's DNA or a fingerprint, but they would need to find it quickly. Exposure to the elements could remove any forensic clues.
Search teams with metal detectors, cutting the grass in people's gardens, cutting back bushes in people's gardens, going into park with the metal detectors, going through the parks, pulling the drains up to see if it's been dumped there. All of those resources are available to us.
Forensic experts were brought in to support the search and analyse any evidence brought in.
When a murder case is investigated, you've got crime scene examiners who will go out and literally recover everything from that area. They're not going to recover totally everything, so if there's a crushed up can that looks like it's been there for weeks, they're not going to pick that up. But if there's a fairly recent looking can, they'll pick that up because it might be something that a killer's left behind.
But there was still no trace of the missing knife.
So we set our parameters within a certain distance of the scene. We couldn't find anything. We set them further away. We couldn't find anything. And then we set them as far as we ever set parameters in any murder I've investigated.
As the search for the knife intensified, there was a setback. News came from officers in Glasgow. The woman who'd threatened to kill Fadi and Nisha had been checked out. The lead had proved false.
It became clear that this was a business difficulty between her and Fadi Nasri. We had, at that point, no evidence linking her to anybody in London. So at the very early stage, a decision was made that she wasn't a suspect at that point.
So, a case of a Glaswegian losing their temper because they think they've been ripped off. Wouldn't be the first time. In terms of motive, the investigation was back to square one. It now became vital that the police find the knife. It was the only lead they had. They kept searching. Then, 10 streets away, in a drain at the edge of the extended search area, they got a result.
2 weeks after the murder, at the very final junction, we found in the drain a knife.
I got the phone call from DS Adam Manley. He just said, "You're not going to believe this, we found the knife." I didn't really know what to say because I'd almost given up hope of finding it at that stage.
Did we have the killer's fingerprints on it? Did we have the killer's DNA on it?
The knife was discovered down a drain, but the drain was very much silted up, so the knife had just been stuck in the earth and the water would have just been washing over it, would have been sitting in puddles of water.
Forensics expert Dr. Jennifer Guest was called in again, but it seemed unlikely that a DNA marker or fingerprint would still be on a knife that had lain in a drain for 2 weeks.
With something which has been partially submerged in water, makes things really difficult. So the DNA is water soluble, so we're going to lose the DNA, but also a lot of the things that we look for in fingerprints are water soluble too. So there's sort of two aspects of fingerprints that you're looking for to try and find finger marks on items. So one is the amino acids, the proteins, and those are water soluble. So if something's been submerged in water, then those are likely to be lost. And the other ones are sort of oil-based, and also anything that's in a contaminant, like a grease or a food substance. So that's what we targeted. And there was actually a partial finger mark already present on the knife, and that was enhanced further by some chemical treatments as well.
And we got the fingerprint of the cleaning lady who cleaned the house for Nisha, and we also got elements of the DNA of Nisha on the knife. So clearly now we knew we had a murder weapon. So this was the first piece of hard evidence we had.
The police might have the murder weapon, but there was not one single forensic trace of the killer on it. That might have set the inquiry back even further if it weren't for one astonishing piece of good fortune. Close to where the knife had been dumped was a CCTV camera. Had the killer made a mistake? Had they been caught on camera getting rid of the murder weapon?
Sadly, the camera didn't focus on the drain itself, but there was a car parked just in front of the drain. And shortly after the attack, you could see a car clearly must have stopped by that drain because of the headlights shining on that parked car.
And in that camera, at about the right time, we saw an Audi A4 come to stop for about 15 to 20 seconds and then start up again. Clearly, that car was the major piece of evidence we needed. We needed to find that car.
The model of car was an Audi A4, but the quality of CCTV footage was too poor to make out a number plate. Without the plate number, the odds against finding the car were huge.
We then go to the police national computer and they let us know there are around about 14,000 cars of that type made.
But detectives spotted something distinct about the Audi that narrowed the odds.
Well, there were two things that made that car identifiable. The rear number plate had one of its lights missing, and it had a Stinger aerial on the middle of the rear of the roof.
And that was a non-standard fit. If you'd bought that car from an Audi dealership and asked for an aerial to be fitted, it wouldn't be put just there.
So we broke London and the South East into postal codes, and we went out, we looked for a car which had a Stinger aerial. And if we'd found a Stinger aerial, we would have started the car, and then we would have found whether the number plate light wasn't working.
I think the whole team had a bit of an Audi A4 obsession. It's very difficult not to see one. When you're out with your family or just driving along or see one parked, just make a mental note of the number plate, go back and tick it off the spreadsheet.
Everywhere I went, I looked for that Audi. On duty, off duty, on holiday, everywhere I looked for it. And there are similar cars, there are similar model cars, there are similar shaped cars. And so I would see my car 2 or 3 times a day everywhere I went, and then you'd see it wasn't an Audi. We knew we needed to find that car. We knew that car was the physical evidence that would link our murder to the person who killed Nisha. We couldn't find it. We looked and looked and looked and couldn't find it.
So, where does an investigation go when the leads offered by every piece of critical evidence dry up? The motive of the Glasgow woman's threatening phone call had proven to be a red herring. The murder weapon didn't yield a forensic trace of the killer, and the hunt for the Audi in the CCTV footage was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. What can investigators do when a murder inquiry is going nowhere?
You find you're having to motivate the team more. You have to motivate yourself more to keep on looking and to keep reassuring them and yourself that the evidence will come if you keep looking for it.
I have got to get my team to work harder, to go out, to do the extra little bit in order to get the job moving on. If you stop an investigation, you're never going to clear that investigation up. You're never going to get justice for Nisha.
And when detectives took a closer look at the critical evidence, they discovered that there was another woman in Fadi Nasri's life.
We knew about his relationship with another woman.
There's one thing that never changes: murder.
The evidence must be gathered. The evidence must be analyzed.
We have to play this game to get to the truth.
Why would an innocent person
choose to go to jail?
One of the most powerful things is the moment when a crime is solved. The voice of the victim hasn't been silenced.
The investigation into the horrific murder of 29-year-old hairdresser Nisha Patel Nasri was in trouble. After nearly 2 months, the only link detectives had to the killer was CCTV footage of a car they couldn't find. It was time to begin again. It was time to take another closer look at the critical evidence. Early in the investigation, when asked who he suspected of killing his wife, Nisha's husband had presented police with a recording of a threatening phone call he'd received.
You are so dead.
The lead had gone nowhere.
Now we've still got Fadi's phone because he recorded the Scottish minicab owner on it. And so as part of that phone, it is downloaded. And whilst we're looking at the downloads, we become aware of his photographs on there. And there's a photograph of a lady's leg. I'd also seen Nisha and could tell that it most probably wasn't her leg. So there were some questions to be asked of Fadi there. So he was asked about the photograph. He certainly didn't come straight out and say he was seeing someone else. But then it was later on, obviously, he'd thought about it and he decided to tell us that he was having an affair. That was difficult for us because up until that point, we were still very much told that Nisha was in a happy relationship.
And this affair was no casual fling. Fadi had been secretly seeing his mistress for several months. He'd even taken her on holiday to Egypt, telling Nisha he had gone to visit a dying uncle. In the 2 months that they'd been carrying out this investigation, detectives had struggled to establish a motive for Nisha's brutal murder. But now they discovered something that might provide some answers. Was it possible that Fadi's mistress was involved in Nisha's death? They had to investigate whether Nisha's murder was a crime of passion. And with nothing else to go on, detectives brought the woman in for questioning.
It was something we had to clear up because it could have led to motive. She's another potential suspect.
She was a very important person to find. We eventually interviewed her and she made no comment. And we were never able to prove she had any involvement in this murder.
So, nothing to implicate Fadi's mistress in Nisha's murder. But Fadi Nasri hadn't been 100% open with the investigators. That's enough for any good investigator to raise an eyebrow. Dr. Donna Youngs is an investigative psychologist specializing in criminal profiling.
It's the fact that under these conditions, in these circumstances, when his wife has just been brutally murdered, and surely he must want to do everything he possibly can to be open and honest with the police and help them, that he's concealing the affair. I think it's that makes us start to look at this man again.
So what else might the victim's husband be hiding from the police? It was the data on Fadi Nasri's phone that had exposed his double life. What other relationships might he have concealed?
Whilst looking at those phone records, we began to develop a pattern of calls, and particularly a pattern between Fadi Nasri and a man called Roger Leslie.
Roger Leslie was a notoriously violent drug dealer. The studs in his face were said to represent the people he'd killed. Why was Fadi Nasri in contact with someone like him?
There was no obvious link at that stage between the two, suggests that they were acquaintances, and Roger Leslie was quite an intimidating man.
There was a certain time when I sat down with DCI Nick Scola and we looked at the evidence, and he pointed out a particular phone call, which was a phone call made from Roger Leslie to Fadi Nasri very shortly after the murder. And at that point, Fadi Nasri was at a snooker club in northwest London, so he hadn't been told about the murder by that point. But the fact that Roger Leslie was phoning him seemed to us an important thing. We started suspecting why is Roger Leslie, this person who, as far as we knew, historically had no relationship with Fadi Nasri, why was he calling him at the very moment in which Fadi Nasri's wife was being murdered? What happened?
All this painted a much darker picture. Was Nasri involved in drug trafficking through his limo business? Was Leslie extorting money from Nasri?
So the hypothesis formed that Roger Leslie was threatening Fadi Nasri, and the attack on Nisha was just collateral damage because Nasri wasn't there.
Or was the attack more than a mistake? The quick, brutal style of Nisha's murder suggested something far more deliberate.
This is an absolute minimalistic, instrumental, functional murder.
In other words, was the murder of Nisha Patel Nasri a professional hit?
So that was the point at which we suddenly thought, OK, let's look at Fadi Nasri. Let's look at Roger Leslie. Let's look at Fadi Nasri. Let's branch out from those. Let's have those at the centre of our investigation. Let's see whether we can make anything of those phone calls. And that's when it started to move on. That's when the investigation really started to move on quickly.
The police accessed the drug dealer's phone records to see whether he'd been near Nisha the night she was killed. By pinpointing phone masts Leslie's mobile had used for a signal when he made those calls, police could work out his location at the time of the murder.
But when we looked at Leslie's phone data, his phone wasn't near the scene at the time of the attack. Yet looking more closely at that same data, we could see that every time there's a call between Leslie and Nasri, shortly afterwards there's a call between Leslie and someone called Tony Emmanuel. So we looked at Tony Emmanuel, and lo and behold, he was linked to an Audi A4.
We went and looked at that particular car, and it had the Stinger aerial. Got the keys, and the rear number plate light wasn't working as well. We had our murder vehicle.
But was there any physical evidence in the car to support this? Once again, forensic expert Jennifer Guest was called in to examine the Audi.
I was asked to examine an Audi in this case, so all of the seats and all the fabric surfaces were taped for fibres. We also used luminol, which is a chemical which is very sensitive to trace amounts of blood and even diluted blood. When we folded down this armrest in the back seat and sprayed it with luminol, a reaction came up which really to me looked like the shape of a knife. And I got so excited because I thought, that's exactly what you could do. You could have the armrest there, you could put a knife in it and you could fold it back up and it'd be out of the way and nobody would see it. And that would be a great hiding spot.
So, what exactly did the investigation actually have? They found the Audi. They had evidence to prove it was linked to Nisha's murder. They had phone data evidence that the Audi driver had been in contact with Roger Leslie at the time of the attack, and that Leslie had called Fadi Nasri at this exact time. 6 months after Nisha's murder, detectives still didn't have a clear picture of what had happened and why. But somehow, Fadi Nasri was connected to his wife's murder.
The decision was made to arrest Tony Emmanuel and Roger Leslie, and at the same time, speak to Fadi, tell him what we knew and the fact we had got to the suspects through his phone data, in the hope that at that stage he would say, I'm sorry, Nick, I was scared of these guys. Now you've got that, I'll tell you what happened, and I'll tell you what they're threatening, I'll tell you they're threatening me, and I'll tell you what the background was.
At the same time, Roger Leslie and the driver of the Audi captured on CCTV were also facing questions. But they were admitting nothing.
When we first interviewed them, there was a mixture of no comments and answers that really didn't lead us anywhere. You're uncertain where things are going, so you need to continue working. You need to find more evidence.
At this stage, the police were banking on Fadi confiding in them. They needed his evidence to understand what had happened and why Nisha had been killed.
And just when I thought he was going to tell me the background to the murder and why it happened, he burst into tears. We then had a very surreal experience of him breaking down and crying, going and composing himself in the toilet, coming back, and as soon as I started to speak effectively, he broke down again, and he just kept repeating, Nick, I can't tell you what's happened just yet, I'm not ready to tell you. I was thinking, is he so scared of these people, he can't tell me? Is it because he feels guilty because the early hypotheses that he knew they were coming round and he had just fled the scene, not thinking Nisha would go outside, and she did, and it was just guilt on his part?
There's no physical evidence connecting Roger Leslie with the murder, connecting the driver with the murder. There's no fingerprints, there's no DNA. The evidence is circumstance, it's contact, it's telephoned calls between them.
But even though the evidence was circumstantial, It was so compelling that after 2 days, the driver of the Audi started to talk. He admitted driving to Nisha's house, but stated he wasn't alone. He believed his passenger had killed Nisha.
Emmanuel's statement was that he was very much the driver, and although he initially wouldn't name the person he was with, eventually he did.
The Audi's passenger was Jason Jones, a nightclub bouncer with 76 convictions, including robbery, burglary, and the assault of a police officer. Emmanuel stated that he knew nothing about the intention to kill Nisha, and that Jones had taken his phone to communicate with Roger Leslie.
Luckily for us, Jones was not only using Emmanuel's phone to phone Leslie, he was using Emmanuel's phone to phone his own contacts and friends. And when you look back through Emmanuel's phone data, you could see those numbers had never been rung by Emmanuel at any stage before. It's only when he said Jones had his phone that those numbers were contacted.
Emmanuel also gave police another piece of information that further corroborated his story.
He told us that Jason Jones had been inside and then come outside and talked about seeing cash laying on the settee, because we knew that was true and we knew that we hadn't publicised that fact. So suddenly the scene that didn't make sense began to make sense. The fact the knife had gone from the back room, it was surrounded by champagne glasses that weren't knocked over, so it hadn't been taken in a struggle. And a hypothesis came about whereby someone had keys to allow themselves into the house. If that person had then gone to the kitchen and taken the knife, Nisha being upstairs had heard them. There's the terrifying prospect that Nisha has gone down the stairs, seen Jones coming towards her with a large knife in his hand, and she has just had to flee out of that front door.
But who could have supplied the killer with a set of keys? This question prompted a truly shocking theory. Had Fadi Nasri orchestrated the murder of his wife?
He had an awful lot to gain if Nisha was murdered.
After 7 frustrating months of investigating the murder of Nisha Patel Nasri, detectives were finally closing in on the truth behind her killing. They now had the name of the suspected killer, violent criminal Jason Jones. They also knew that Jones had been inside the house and that there was no evidence of a forced entry.
There were a number of facts that didn't make sense. Both the front door and the porch door that were mortise-locked would have needed those door keys to unlock them, and Fadi said he locked them when he went to play snooker. Jason Jones must have had keys to get in. It was all very much set up.
Had Fadi Nasri supplied those keys to the killer? The more closely detective looked at Nasri, the more likely it seemed he knew Nisha was going to be murdered.
Whilst he had a strong alibi, we couldn't break, two things always struck me about that alibi. A, when I was talking about it quite early, he told me I'd see him on CCTV outside the snooker club, which I thought was a peculiar thing to say. And B, the attack took place less than 10 minutes after he left home, which was a coincidence, and I don't always like coincidences.
We also looked at the day when we found a knife. We have to tell the husband that we found a knife. It's an important event for a victim's family. We told him about the knife. Immediately afterwards, there's a peak of contact between him and Roger Leslie. So clearly, he was getting information from us and he was passing it on.
So, what was Roger Leslie's role in this? The phone evidence pointed to one conclusion. Jason Jones, the man they now strongly suspected of being the killer, had called Leslie immediately after Nisha was stabbed. Leslie had then called Fadi. This was before the neighbour called Fadi to say his wife had been attacked. Had Leslie arranged Nisha's murder on Fadi's behalf?
It's my belief now that Roger Leslie was told that she had been killed and he was passing that information on to Fadi Nasri. People cannot help but tell other people of their achievements. Roger Leslie, we believe, was the person who found the killer on his behalf.
After 7 months of intense investigation, one in which Fadi Nasri had never figured as a suspect, the realization that he might have ordered his wife's killing came as a shock to detectives.
To think that the man I'd been sitting talking to was actually callous enough to arrange the murder of his wife. It was strange to almost just to sit down quietly and think to yourself, have I got this right?
We all offend, but it's only serious committed criminals who offend for instrumental purposes, who offend directly for another objective. And that's what seems to be going on here. The crime is committed because Nasri needs it to be committed. End of story.
So why did Fadi Nasri need his wife to be murdered? The motive for Nisha's killing had always evaded police, but that's what they sought now. They needed to find critical evidence of motive. Now that Fadi Nasri was in the frame, officers went back to the victim's friends and family and started asking more questions. And bit by bit, they began painting the police a very different picture of the relationship between Fadi Nasri and his wife.
You suddenly got a feeling that their relationship was not as strong as we were being told at first. People were coming out and saying, look, their marriage was on the rocks, their financial records, there was clearly debt there. They owed a large mortgage for the house, they owed money for the limousines. The company that owned the limousines only had 2 shares in it. Both of those shares were owned by Nisha. If they divorced, she would have walked away with the limousine company. If they divorced, he would have got nothing from the house, he would have lost the car company, and he would have had no money.
We knew that Nasri was having an affair. We knew that he was heavily in debt and that Nisha's death would resolve those debt issues.
They both had full insurance on the whole value of the house. If she died, he got the house, debt-free, he got the car company, and he would have got any endowments she had and any money she had. In terms of a motive, that's a huge motive.
In fact, only a few weeks after Nisha's murder, Nasri had cashed in the couple's life insurance policy. With Nisha dead, Fadi Nasri stood to gain close to £500,000. When detectives arrived to arrest Nasri and charge him with murder, they found him living with his mistress. The case went to trial, and in the face of all the critical evidence against him, Fadi Nasri was jailed for 20 years for the murder of his wife, Nisha. He never admitted his guilt. Tony Emmanuel was found not guilty. Roger Leslie received 18 years for organizing the murder. Jason Jones was jailed for 20 years for carrying it out.
Suddenly you sit there in a car travelling back from somewhere and you suddenly work out what's happened, and the weight comes off your shoulders because you've had pressure on you. Pressure from the outside, but your own pressure on yourself. You go from working 20 hours a day and you might actually have a home life again. And those are really important things. But over and above all, you're getting justice for Nisha, you're getting justice for her family.